Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Shaul Hortzman, as you can see. I'm pleased to be here with my colleague Nacho. He will be, of course, the technical, bring the technical aspect to this webinar, and I'll try to provide as much information as I can. Two words about myself. I've been working in Intezer here for about a year now. I have a background in incident response forensics, and I've been working with various Linux systems for the past 7 or 8 years. So I really like this topic, and I'm happy to do this webinar. And we're going to begin. Nacho, do you want to say anything about yourself before we start?
My name is Nacho San Millán. I'm mainly focused in reverse engineer. I have an extensive background on ELF obfuscation methodologies, and I have studied for a long time the ELF file format. Most of my work is based on Linux malware analysis, and I've been working in Intezer for 2 years. That's pretty much it.
Great. So let's begin by just talking about the main topic that we're going to discuss. The topic of the webinar is the Linux threat landscape. And we find this as a very important topic to talk about in the security community. If you've been following our blog posts, you can see that we've been publishing various researches, many from our own Nacho San Millán, about different new Linux threats from various types and places. So in this webinar, we want to talk about broadly about the different threats that you might find in this landscape, and also talk about some issues with how the security industry treats this landscape, and some issues with the detection and classification of new and advanced Linux threats that we don't see as much information about out there. So we hope to shine a light on that issue and also provide you with some comprehensive information on overall threats that you might find in Linux. So just quickly going over the agenda, we're going to describe the Linux threat landscape from our perspective. We're going to talk about also some reasons for low detection rates overall among different security vendors for Linux threats. And also we're going to dive in and discuss some advanced targeted threats, some of them nation-sponsored, and some of them just more advanced technologically. And of course, later we were going to present some recommendations on how you can mitigate or prevent such an attack compromising your own resources or your organization. So without further ado, let's start with talking about the Linux landscape. So Nacho, I think we discuss it a lot among ourselves, but people many times say that Linux is the most secure and safe operating system, and that there are no real threats for anyone working with such an operating system. So I would be happy to hear your perspective on what are threats that we might see in Linux, and what's the difference between those type of threats and Windows threats, and also why do people say that it's so secure?
Sure. So yeah, I heard this statement for a while now, and in some aspect, it's true that Linux is obviously a open source operating system, and in terms of vulnerability awareness, there is a much more visibility in that sense. So in that sense, it's also make it a more secure operating system in terms of vulnerability assessment and discovery. However, I'm not very sure about whether Linux is a more safe operating system overall. And I think the reason for this claim is essentially because Linux is composed of many devices run Linux, not just servers, but there is desktops, there is IoT devices, there is cloud infrastructure, and so on. And we don't see mainly that the malware is targeting, we don't see much malware targeting end users, endpoints in that sense. So I think this claim comes from the fact that not many desktop users get affected by malware. but that doesn't mean that there is not a lot of malware, targeting other type of devices such as IoT or cloud infrastructure, which is mostly the domains where we see most malware being found, right?
Mhm. Yeah, so as we can see in this slide, and as Nacho mentioned, the threats that Linux users are in danger of being infected by are different than the ones that we usually hear in the Windows world. So of course, Windows is the predominant operating system for users, for endpoints. And of course, there are users of Linux operating systems for their own endpoints, but of course, they make the far smaller percentage of endpoints out there. So it makes sense for attackers to focus on Windows when they usually attack the end users. But of course, also as you mentioned, Nacho, Linux is a very predominant in other worlds of servers, of IoT devices, of course, network devices, and basically the infrastructure behind all of these different endpoints. So, of course, the attacks will be different. So could you tell us a little bit about the predominant attacks that we see today in the Linux landscape?
Right. So mostly what we see today is that the biggest domain of Linux devices that get attacked today is IoT, and the reason because of that is because IoT devices are very, very unsecure. They usually have very outdated firmware and contain a lot of vulnerabilities, and there's a lot of threat actors that want to take advantage of that. And in the Linux threat landscape, we see three different sort of domains. We see common malware, malware that is not that common, and then we see advanced malware. And the common malware usually is composed of DDoS bots and crypto miners, and it makes complete sense because these two different malware types take very easy. So they take an approach of very easy monetization of devices, and since IoT is composed of many devices, it's a very trivial way of making money out of those devices via DDoS operations or DDoS as a service, or on the other hand, just mining cryptocurrencies. So that would be the domain of common malware. Like, if you deploy a honeypot, an SSH honeypot, within 5 minutes, you will see thousands of hits, and most of them will probably be either crypto miners or DDoS bots. On the other hand, we see uncommon threats, which these are things like file infectors or ransomware. They're not as common as DDoS bots or crypto miners, but for example, just today, just a few minutes ago, we published some research regarding a ransomware that we found that targeted the NAS service. And you see, it's not like very, very common malware that you see every day, but it definitely exists. And in a way, it makes sense that ransomware is not that predominant in Linux because, as I said, there's not that many endpoint users, or the domain of endpoint users within the Linux IT landscape is very small. So it makes sense that there is not many ransomware. And then what is more interesting is file infectors, because I'm pretty sure everybody that is hearing us has some knowledge of file infectors in Windows, and probably know that if you have a file infected file with RAPNet or Parite or Virut or any of these very common file infectors in Windows, if you scan that and you upload that in VirusToro or something, you will see that the file is highly detected. On the other hand, in Linux, that's the completely opposite. So there is, of course, very specific ways of injecting code in Linux. However, they are completely under the radar in terms of detection. Many antivirus vendors, they are not even aware that these techniques exist. And file infectors are usually very, very low detected. And then lastly, we see a domain of advanced threats that are mainly composed of Trojans and backdoors. And this is because usually, and APT is a state sponsor actors. And this is because Usually, as I said, Linux devices are very easy to monetize because they're portable for the most part. But then when you find a malware that is actually targeting a set of devices or something, it's most likely some advanced threat, and that has a predefined set of victims. And usually we see APTs deploying Trojans, backdoors, or rootkits. So yeah, that would be the 3 different domains that we can see in the Linux threat landscape.
Great, thank you. By the way, I just read the new blog today before the webinar. It was fascinating. So I really encourage everyone listening to go to intezer.com, to our blog. I'll give you some information about it, not too many spoilers, but it's a complete campaign that Nacho uncovered of ransomware in Linux NAS servers. So as we mentioned, of course, you won't see many ransomware targeting Linux endpoints, but what they did was target the file server. So all of the important information in the organization, that's where it's saved and backed up. So that's a perfect place for a Linux ransomware to go. But not only that you discovered it, you were able to shut it down temporarily by, well, I'm not going to give that away. If you want to see or hear how Nacho shut down 15 campaigns at the same time, read the blog. So I think, I hope this was clear for everyone, and we're going to go deeply into each of these different types of threats. So we're going to talk about DDoS botnets, crypto miners, and also APTs. But before that, something important you mentioned, Nacho, is one of the issues with detecting Linux threats is that, as the example you mentioned shows with file infectors, is that you don't even have the way to detect the suspicious behavior or the injection type that happens in Linux. So you don't really have the way to start detecting that. So the next topic I think we should discuss is the reasons that we see for low detection rates of Linux malware. So Nacho, if you could build on that point also that we mentioned about file infectors, and tell us a bit about why there is such a low detection rate for Linux malware.
Sure. So there is a lot of different factors that are involved in this fact. One of them is that having visibility of Linux malware is very, very hard. So if you search in Google for some research that someone did on a pie chart of the different malware types that exist in Linux and what are the ratio of them, or what are the commonalities of finding them, you won't find anything, because Linux malware has a problem, which is visibility. We don't know what is out there. And the problem, the reason because of this is because the entire antivirus industry is mainly focused on endpoint users, which it makes complete sense. So what happens is that while there is more malware found in Linux servers, in IoT, and so on, antivirus vendors try to, what I think that is happening is that they try to port their current solutions that work in Windows endpoints, try to implement support for Linux running the same heuristics as they will do in Windows. But what they don't realize is that the Linux ecosystem is a completely different ecosystem, and it makes complete sense that the heuristics won't be as efficient as in Windows. So you see that here you start having sort of a cycle that the one thing affects the next one. So, and again, that's mainly the thing. There is not enough visibility. Without enough visibility, we don't know what are the different malware that is out there. And without knowing the malware, we cannot apply effective detection solutions. So that's pretty much what that will be my 2 cents on that matter.
Interesting. So actually, because there's not enough knowledge about Linux malware, there is not enough research, so we don't have the techniques to detect new malware. So then we don't have information and data and IOCs about these pieces of malware. And then, as you said, it's really a vicious cycle of not enough research, so there's not enough detection, which doesn't spur more research. So exactly. Sounds like people should start dedicating more time on research there, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, another reason to read your blogs. Yeah, I hope that this situation will change. And of course, this is one of the issues and the reasons we're talking about this is for the industry to start paying more attention and to focus on Linux malware. So let's start by discussing specific types of malware, starting with DDoS bots. As we mentioned, of course, this is one of the common types of malware, of course, because there are many different devices and servers that are not protected enough, so the attackers are able to take advantage and use them for creating a botnet and then deploying DDoS attacks or for mining cryptocurrency. So here we have two very familiar DDoS bot families, Mirai and China Z. Now, Nacho, you've researched both of them and published those researches. So I'd be happy to hear your input on these two families, their differences, and what they do.
Sure. So obviously, there is a lot more families in the DDoS ecosystem. However, this might be the most popular today. And these are Mirai and China Z. I'm pretty sure everybody here has heard about Mirai at some point. And the Mirai phenomenon is very interesting because the high rate of Mirai variants that we see today literally came from having the Mirai source code leaked. So what happens, and I personally studied the Mirai theme in deep because I wanted to know what was going on behind the scenes. And what seems to be like is that all the Mirai threat actors and all of the Mirai variants that we spot, usually they're not related to one another. The communities behind Mirai are made of very young people, and they just want to have fun, basically. Although they have caused a lot of damage with their DDoS operations. In the sense of the Mirai implant, it's not. I wouldn't consider Mirai as a high complexity malware. That's exactly what Mirai is. It's just a malware that was leaked, that was abused, or is abused by kids that they're just deploying their own instance of Mirai, and they're just literally forking Mirai, adding some exploits or whatever, and they're just deploying, renting some DigitalOcean servers and deploying their instances of Mirai. And then on the other hand, we have China Z, which China Z is a complete different level of threat actor, and in fact is being more operative. It's been operative much longer than Mirai has. There was a big controversy in regards to China Z because researchers didn't know if it was a group or it was a threat actor in particular that it only was responsible of a couple of implants. But I did some research regarding China Z, and it seems that it might be a group of people that are implementing different implants, because we spotted a high level of co-reuse in regards to the implants, to Chinese DDoS implants. And their malware is a much more higher profile malware as well. It's better written. This group is responsible of malware samples such as Elknot and Bill Gates, which are pretty famous in the DDoS community. And yeah, China Z is a completely different threat actor. In fact, there's a lot of researchers that I had the chance to talk about this topic with. One of the biggest groups that were trying to research this group was Malware Must Die. And I had the chance to talk to one of the Malware Must Die guys, and they shared that they had a lead in which implied that some of the China Z guys were recruiting people from Chinese universities in order to write their malware. So that's pretty interesting, and you can see that that's some level, like they obviously have investment to put into those kind of operations. So yeah, it's a completely different threat actor. Yeah.
Interesting. So we can see two DDoS bot families that work in a very different way, but both take advantage of the Linux landscape. Now, I'm going to show an example of Mirai. So I'll just open the browser here. Can you see my screen, Nacho?
I do, yeah.
Perfect. So for everyone who doesn't know Intezer, what you're seeing now is Intezer Analyze. That's one of the platforms that our company is creating and developing. And we're using this to demonstrate how the code looks like of Mirai, and also demonstrate what Nacho mentioned about it being used in various different variants, not necessarily connected to each other. So just as a quick explanation, we're not going to do a deep dive of the technology now, but what you see here is an indication on where the code here has been used before. So if Mirai, this example, is comprised out of this amount of genes, so from a percentage standpoint, this is the amount of code that is being used in Mirai, in Gasgate, and Tsunami, etc. So we can really see different families using different amounts of code and coming from Mirai. And actually, in many different ELF or ARM malware, we can see code from Mirai, even if it's not really related, because as Nacho mentioned, since it was leaked, it's being used by different actors, whether it's script kiddies or actual threat actors that are trying to create DDoS attacks. Okay, and back to the presentation.
I wanted to emphasize one last thing about China set, because a lot of people will question like why China said it has been operative for so long. Why hasn't been tracked and remediated? The thing is like shutting down a malware group that has its whole infrastructure hosted in China is very, very challenging. And I know a lot of researchers that literally gave up because they did lots of efforts in order to shut down a specific server or whatnot, and the next day they have a complete different set of a complete different infrastructure hosted in China. Mm-hmm. So that's mainly why Chinese groups are very, very hard to remediate.
Interesting. So moving forward from DDoS bots, let's talk about some crypto miners. So in this case, the Rocket Group and Pacha Group are also two threat actors that you've investigated in the past. Can you tell us more about these groups, who's behind them, and also tell us about their interesting relationship?
Yeah, sure. So Rocket Group was first discovered by Talos, Cisco Talos. And in their initial publication, they mentioned Intezer because we at Intezer, we also did a lot of research behind Iron Group. And apparently some of the TTPs found that Rocket Group was using, it had commonality with Iron Groups. So it has a medium confidence attribution to Iron Group, and it's also a Chinese group. So in a way, it makes sense. And this group, it has deployed sophisticated campaigns. Before I say anything, I want to highlight that in general, the DDoS ecosystem is not as sophisticated as the crypto mining ecosystem in the sense of malware, because we see that malware implants that are part of a crypto mining operation, they tend to use much more stealthy and persistent techniques than DDoS bots would. Mm-hmm. And I will talk about why in a minute. But so Rocket Group has been spot to. So Talos, when they reported Rocket Group, they said that they were downloading implants from Pastebin. They actually opened a GitHub account. They had a public GitHub account where they were hosting some malware. And they, along with the malware, they had also a complete tool set of social engineering and phishing utilities, such as fake Chrome alerts, fake apps, a lot of different things. It obviously got shut down. And one of the highlights of their malware is that they have functionality to uninstall security products. And that's pretty interesting. And this was actually reported a few months after by Unit 42 from Palo Alto Networks, when they spotted that some of the Rocket Group implants that they detected, they actually were uninstalling a cloud-based cloud security products. And then on the other hand, we have Pacha Group. And Patcha Group is a threat actor that we at Intezer discovered, and it was completely undetected before we reported it. He also the infrastructure that Patcha Group has is huge. Like their operations, that maybe 15 binaries are when they compromise the system, maybe 15 binaries are deployed within one compromised system. So uninfecting a given compromised system is really, really hard. They use sophisticated techniques that I personally haven't seen in other malware. Like, for example, when they drop a binary from their CNC or whatnot, they make sure that the timestamp of the downloaded binary is the same one as the rest of the file system, so that the drop binary remains completely undetected.
Mm.
Well, not completely undetected, but in terms of timestamp, there is not an anomaly, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And also, they implemented a huge way, like a huge set of techniques to blacklist other miners. And this is interesting because this same technique is also applied in the DDoS ecosystem, but it's known as bot killing. But in crypto miners, it's just known as miner killing, and it's probably much more offensive and dominant in the crypto mining scene. And we saw like a lot of techniques ranging from process name blacklisting, file path blacklisting, IP blacklisting, and with an emphasis on emphasizing Patcha Group, we saw that they were really trying to hunt Rocket Group's implants, which it was really interesting when we spotted. And also Patcha Group had replicated some of the Rocket Group's techniques, such as uninstalled cloud environment, cloud protection solutions, and so on. So yeah, very interesting, especially because both of these groups allegedly they are Chinese, and when you see two Chinese groups trying to take over the foothold of each other, is pretty interesting, and that shows that whatever the target systems that they were targeting, in this case cloud-based infrastructure, it seems that is very, very demanded and very targeted.
Interesting. So actually, like, if they don't have a specific beef with each other, these two groups, it looks like that the crypto mining field in Linux is already so crowded that they need to push each other off of infected servers, right?
Exactly.
Crazy. So that's also another reason for the security vendors out there to start focusing on Linux, because it looks like there's a lot of things to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so moving on from crypto miners, let's talk about some advanced threats, which are of course less common, but interesting as well, of course. Starting with SSH backdoors. So this is of course something that is more relevant for Linux servers because of the SSH protocol. Could you tell us more about this type of threat and what its effects are on Linux servers?
Sure. So we mentioned SSH backdoors, but it's not really. It doesn't necessarily have to be related to SSH, the client SSH. So basically, we say SSH backdoors because ESET published some white paper in which they discover, I don't know how many different variants of SSH backdoors. So they're pretty predominant, right? But basically what this means is that in Linux, in an open source ecosystem, an operating system, there is the capability of cloning a specific genuine benign binary that is open source and implementing some sort of malicious functionality to it. And in terms of detection, that's very, very hard to spot unless you know exactly what the malicious code looks like, you know. And not only that, but there is also an interesting factor that is how these SSH or these malicious, genuine, modified binaries get deployed in the first place. And there was not too long ago, like I think a few days ago, there was this so Canonical got compromised, and this is also a very interesting fact in the open source community because there is a lot of companies that have their whole code base publicly exposed to the world via GitHub. So this really implies that there is, vectors like attack vectors that would resemble supply chain attacks, but they're much more accessible in Linux because of the nature of open source. So and this is not something that is very uncommon. Like a few months ago, Rust GitHub repository was also compromised, and many others that we probably don't even know. And the thing that what this can actually do is that if a threat actor actually breaks into this kind of repositories and is able to modify the code base in a way that implements a malicious functionality to it that is unknown, that might be where these kind of implants or malicious malware gets, also malicious binaries get deployed. But it's very interesting because these sort of attacks and these sort of vectors, we don't see them to happen this way in Windows because of the nature of open source, right? So it's very important to highlight this because it's very unique to Linux.
Yeah, so for instance, in Windows, you had the CCleaner attack a few years ago. And for that, of course, the attackers had to hack CCleaner. So they didn't have their code up on GitHub. So that really makes it easier in Linux to create these sort of supply chain attacks and then create open a door for you to a huge amount of victims that just used an SSH or any other tool to remotely connect to their server. So that's really interesting, and also shows us the unique quality of this threat landscape. So moving on to additional advanced threats, I wanted to talk a bit about state-sponsored threats. So we hear a lot about APTs from China, from Russia, from many other countries that are used for different reasons, of course, different naturally from the uses of DDoS botnets or crypto miners, but we don't really hear about those type of threats in Linux architectures. So could you walk through the different threats or nation-sponsored threats in Linux that we've seen in the past years?
Yeah, sure. So it's well known that state-sponsored threat actors have Linux implants, and I'm pretty sure that this is a pretty good list of known Linux implants that state-sponsored actors have deployed. There is way more than this, but we just don't know. Again, because the visibility is not great, right? But we can see that for example, in the United States based state-sponsored actors, they in the Shadow Brokers leak a whole tool set of binaries and implants that were mainly targeting Linux, and that's very extraordinary. And also in the Vault 7 leak, there was a lot of frameworks that also targeted Linux devices. And ranging from, and then moving to the Russian side of things, it's well known that APT28 in the Vist backdoor was uncovered. Sebrosi is a Go implant that doesn't really have a ELF build, like an actual discover build, but based on that, it's a Go implant. It's very, very easy to port, and probably they deployed Linux-based implants. APT29, they found out that some of the scripts that they were using had some cross-platform functionality, in the sense that there were some Linux artifacts as well there. So APT29 has also deployed Linux implants. And then Turla, there was this backdoor called Peking Turla that is also pretty well known. And on the Chinese side, just recently, Chronicle published that they found what happened to be two artifacts that were related to the Winty umbrella. One of them was an SSL-based rootkit, And us, Intezer, we published our research on some malware that we call Hidden Wasp, that later on was also attributed to Winty by AT&T researchers. And this is funny because when we were researching Hidden Wasp, we saw a lot of similarities with the malware that Chronicle published. However, we didn't have enough leads to actually have a high confidence attribution. But then later on, we saw that other companies did have those resources. So, but it's pretty interesting. So here you see like a wide range of state-sponsored threat actors.
So that's also very interesting, and it also brings us to the next topic, where we would dive in to Hidden Wasp, the malware that made you famous.
Well, yeah, super famous.
So moving on, as I mentioned, and focusing on a specific Chinese threat in this case, as you mentioned, also classified as part of Winty after your investigation. This is a malware that you uncovered, which was previously not detected at all, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So is there anything special about this malware family, or was it just not detected because of a lack of resources, as we mentioned before?
I just think that there wasn't enough visibility because to detect this malware, at least the user land rootkit was trivial because it shared a lot of different artifacts with the genuine SSL rootkit, which, by the way, is open source. But yeah, we spotted this threat. It got deployed. Well, it had two different components. One was a user space rootkit that again was an SSL fork, and then it had a main Trojan that the rootkit will hide. They communicated with each other with an environment variable. That the environment variable was I am hidden. That's why we label it Hidden Wasp. And yeah, it implemented techniques that I haven't seen before. For example, one of them was that it patched the dynamic linker. So the dynamic linker is in charge to enforce the LD preload mechanism in Linux, which essentially LD preload, what it does is to take precedence of a given library that you want, and that in the loading process, so that library will be loaded first in every process. And what Hidden Wasp did, what Hidden Wasp did was to patch the dynamic linker so that the path of where the configuration relies for LD preload will be in an arbitrary location. And that's something that I haven't seen before, which is interesting. And regarding the Trojan, well, the user space rootkit also shares some code with Mirai, so they seem to borrow the configuration, the coding algorithm. It's slightly modified, but it's exactly the same, and it's easy to spot. And regarding the Trojan, the Trojan also, as we see in this analysis, also share some common MD5 implementation with ElkNot malware, which is also interesting.
Oh, great. So we can actually see it in the code reuse here. The majority of code, as you can see, is from Hidden Wasp, but also we see a small connection to ElkNot, which really coincides with what you mentioned. Great. So after discussing these different types of threats, from the more common one to advanced and nation-sponsored threats, let's talk a bit about mitigation recommendations and what we can do about this type of threats. So to begin with, of course, there is no single solution to solve this issue. And as we mentioned, it's a deep-rooted issue within the security community because there needs to be more research done in this field in order to raise the level of visibility, and then gathering, of course, more evidence and more data in order to make that visibility and our detection capabilities more accurate. But some things that you might be better off doing in order to protect your different systems are the following. So of course, keep all of your systems patched and updated, all of the different servers and devices, and update any signature-based solution that you use in order to keep up with different threats. Of course, from remote control standpoint with SSH login, it's important to remove the option to log in via credentials, because then you are prone to be attacked by brute force attempts, and that's exactly what happened with the ransomware Nacho published a post about today. So they were the victims in that case were compromised by brute force attempts. So of course it's much safer to log in via an SSH key. And of course, malware, once it's installed, will try to achieve persistence. So in Linux, it's important to look at suspicious cron jobs or systemv or systemd initialization scripts, which run when the system boots. And additionally, it's important to disable root accounts and also be very careful with what or how super users can log into the systems. And always, log in with a regular user and then sudo to use root capabilities. Further than that, we wanted to mention, of course, our perspective in Intezer, where we, of course, focus on code reuse detection. So as we mentioned and showed in the examples before, we try to detect and classify malware not based on signatures or behavior, but based on the code and where it has been used previously. And I wanted to show some examples that Nacho, of course, found of undetected threats that are still undetected to this day. And this is a very interesting case, and I'll show you why. So Greedy Ant D is an implant from Pacha Group. Am I right, Nacho? So,
sorry. Yeah, it's
great.
Pacha.
So it's an implant by Pacha Group, and you can see here that we detect it as Greedy Ant D. It also shares code with CoinMiner and Mirai. As we mentioned before, Mirai is predominant in this field. But while having this clear detection, if we look at the current result in VirusTotal, we get 0 results. And we see all the 2 other samples I have there in the presentation also get 0 results. But the issue here is that it's not a new threat. If we look at related samples in this case, which are just other samples that share code with this file, we can see a large list of other samples that are classified as Greedy Ant and share code with Greedy Ant D. So let's look at this one, for instance. So you can see that it shares a significant amount of code with what we just saw. And in this instance, VirusTotal gives a much clearer result, 24 detections. So we can see that even when the files are very similar from a code perspective, we still have this disparity in detection in signature-based solutions. So, of course, another way of increasing detection is focusing on code reuse, because once you see that code in a single attack and you classify it, you will be able to protect from it in future cases. Now, before we sign off for questions and answers, if you want to test this solution yourselves, of course, you can join our community for free. Go to analyze.intezer.com. That's analyze.intezer.com, where you can try the solution and use it daily if you'd like, of course. We welcome you to do so. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us. Now, before we finish up here, please, I look forward to answer your questions. Nacho and I would like to hear if you have any questions. I saw some questions in the chat. If anyone else has further questions, feel free to write them down in the Q&A section or here in the chat, and we'll start answering shortly.
Okay, so we got our first 2 questions from Invano, which, by the way, I know Invano, so it's a friend of mine, so I'll be happy to answer his question.
Oh, sure. Go for it.
So, so the first question says, I was curious about the previous Intezer analyze example, given the co-reuse between Mirai and VPN filter genes. And then I'm going to say the second question because I see that it's related. So my answer is going to be applied to both. And the other question that Ivano asked is if two samples are statically linked to the same library, does intersonalize show common Gs between the two? Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Regarding the first question, I'm not really sure about, because I haven't seen that specific analysis genes. But the answer, like probably what is happening is that the Mirai, as you all know, and VPN filter, they had a statically linked implants. And when you statically link binary, sometimes the code changes slightly depending on the compilation flags or optimization flags or GCC version, compiler version, etc. So my bet is that those connections are real, in the sense that it's probably some libc version that we haven't seen in trusted software. However, it's not an attributive connection, meaning that it's not a connection that will attribute those malware families. And you see this a lot because statically linking every single, so indexing every single statically linked library for all optimization flags, for all GCC versions, and optimization levels is very, very hard. So sometimes you will see those type of connections, which by the way are genuine, the code is the same, however, they're not attributive connections. Will that answer your question, Ivano?
Let's see if he answers in the chat. Yeah. Great. And also, I think Ivano asked about the technology itself. I see that Itai answered him, but let's answer everyone. So he asked about the technology itself, the gene and genetic malware analysis technology, which we provide. And he asked whether these genes really represent portions of code, or is it more a generic concept taking into consideration also strings and data? So that's a great question, also Ivano. And as Itai said also in the chat, the genes actually represent assembly code sequences. So the genes themselves are sequences of binary code that we extract and detect and collect a huge amount of data from. And we have a huge database that contains billions of genes, which are all categorized based on where they have been seen before, and that's the information we provide. So also for string information, we provide a different section of string reuse, but that we don't take that into account when calculating the verdict automatically. So we do that based on the code. Okay, I see another question, so just a moment. So Nacho, YA asks, as an InfoSec hobbyist, where can I find more info about the canonical intrusion, and if there are any suggestions for the current systems? So where can we find more information about that attack?
So this was published by all main media outlets. So I'm pretty sure if you do a quick Google search, you will find about it. I'm not sure if Canonical actually published any information about intrusion, which I think they should, and probably they have. But I will probably just go that way. And also, I don't really understand any suggestions for the current system. Could you emphasize on that?
So if you can, please add more information in the chat. I see more questions, so quick questions from Kermit Short. What country is Intezer headquartered in? So we have our headquarters in the US, in New York City. I'm speaking from Tel Aviv, Israel, where our R&D center is. And Nacho is speaking from Spain. So we're very international in that case. Also, Nikita asks how unique are gene sequences for each malware family, whether they are focused on code unique to the family, or is it a more general map of the malware program flow? So Nikita, the genes are extracted the same way for every file, and they are represented individually. So the genes are not a map of the program flow, but actually small pieces of binary code that we extract and then compare to what we have in the database. I hope that answers the question. And of course, you can send us an email or tweet at us, and we can provide more information. Another question from Arun. What is the workflow on using the system? Is it replacing an antivirus? So that's a great question. Intezer doesn't aim to replace antiviruses. We provide a different approach. So the workflow there is, as you saw, we can upload a file either manually or automatically. Then the file is automatically disassembled. Genes are extracted, compared to our database, and we provide a result. It's a very fast process, and it's just a completely different approach from antiviruses. We aim to provide that information automatically to incident response teams, to SOC teams, and also for researchers to get more valuable information and also quickly, because we know that the skills needed to reverse engineer a file and to deeply investigate it are not something that's easy to come by. You need to learn a lot, and this system really provides those attributes and information in a quick way. Let's see if we have more questions. Okay, any about updating? So YA is asking whether it's dangerous, or should we take precautions before updating information from Canonical's repositories. Not sure, do you know if they already fixed their issue?
I mean, they should have. I mean, I think in Canonical, could not afford to have a vulnerable repository for more than a few days. So
yeah.
The thing with this is that if a given repository is compromised and we don't know, there is really not that much that you can do unless you are super cautious and proactively hunting for malware in your system. But nobody does that, so it's literally not your responsibility in a way, right? But it is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I see that Ari writes that they did fix it. Arun asks another question. Do threat researchers get genes or a list of similar binaries? Yes, as you saw before, when we jumped to a specific family, when we clicked it, I think that was in the greedy ant D case. You could see other samples, other pieces of malware that shared code. So they were related and similar based on shared code in that sense. Okay, so this I answered. We have a few minutes left, so if you have any more questions, please feel free to write them down in the chat. And thank you, Kermit, for your kind words. Okay, I see a question. So Ian asks, is detection of malware more difficult on Linux distros designed for very low hardware requirements? So that probably means IoT devices and other small devices. So Nacho, is detection more hard on Linux distributions that are designed for smaller, lightweight systems?
I don't think. I mean, it really depends what kind of solution you have, or if you have any solution whatsoever. But based on the current state of security solutions in Linux, I mean, if it's not a Mirai invariant or something like that, it's probably going to go undetected, to be completely honest. So yeah, I don't know if that answers my question, the question, but
I think that's a good answer. Nikita asks, how effective has gene sequencing been against packed samples? So Nikita, that's a great question. And first of all, I recommend trying out the community. You also have some examples there of packed samples and the unpacking process. Packing is an issue, of course, with malware analysis, because in the end, it hides the code and the true payload within the file. But we also see it as a shortcut for attackers who use it in order to not write the code from scratch. They use it to hide the payload itself. So we do have ways to unpack samples. We can do it dynamically or statically. Short answer is that we can send the file to be executed on a sandbox just for the file to unpack itself. load to memory, then we dump the process, and we can analyze the payload statically, like we've done with static files. So I hope that answers that question. I see another message in the chat. So do you see the threat landscape for Linux growing in 2019, 2020? If so, which family do you see being the biggest contributor? Probably Mirai, but what do you think, Nacho?
I don't think that. I don't think the Linux I don't think there's going to be an increase of Linux malware. I think there's just going to be more visibility because there is already plenty of malware, and we're already seeing that. We already experienced a raise of awareness in the last few months. A lot of Linux malware, well, few months like this year of what we have of 2019, a lot of Linux malware has been uncovered. And I just think it's a matter of time that visibility improves in the Linux ecosystem, and we'll probably start seeing, as the visibility rises, we will see probably a rise as well of more sophisticated malware.
Great. And two last questions I see here. Any plans for Intezer to publish an endpoint scanner for Mac or Linux in the future? So Jose, who asked the questions, I'll just tell you to stay tuned for more information that we will release. But of course, we are looking for solutions which will be more actively monitoring such infrastructures. So yes, just a moment. Yeah, and Ali says that for sure there will be more Linux malware. I agree. And last question before we finish up from YA. Are you familiar with GDRA and reverse engineering tools? But I can answer for Nacho that he's very familiar with them. Nacho, do you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, I reverse engineer things for a living, so I must be.
Yeah, and of course, also we have a research team that Nacho is a part of course, and they reverse engineering malware every day, and they also use a plugin that we created for IDA Pro, which really shortens the time for reverse engineering and provides you with all of the information that Intezer Analyze gives you just on the IDA platform. So you really get the families and connection as a comments on IDA. And last but not least, I know I said it was the last one, but YA put one in the last minute. Info on Intezer blog. Just go to intezer.com and you will have the blog there. So intezer.com. And I recommend reading all of our blog posts, but specifically the last one from today about the Linux ransomware, which was really fascinating in my opinion. So to summarize, and thank you very much everyone for the questions. It was really fun. Thank you everyone for joining. It was a great webinar. For me, it was my first webinar, so it really is exciting. We talked about the Linux threat landscape, the more common threats, the more advanced threat as well, the differences between them and Windows threats, and the problems also in this field with low detection rates, and also talking about why there are such low detection rates, and of course finishing with recommendations on how we can mitigate these types of questions. YA, no need to apologize. I'm happy to answer your questions. So thank you everyone again. If you have any issues or questions about the community, about Intezer, about Linux threats overall, you can contact us. You have the details here as you can see, so contact@intezer.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn @Intezer Labs. We're looking forward to see you there. So thank you again, and have a great day. And thank you, Nacho.
Yeah, thank you.